Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jocelyn Kennedy. I'm the Executive Director of the Harvard Law School Library. Welcome to our book talk. I want to thank the Dean for providing lunch. I also want to let you know that this is being recorded, both the talk and the question and answer period. It's my pleasure to introduce Cass Sunstein, the Robert Walmsley University professor here at Harvard. From 2009 to 2012, he was administrator of the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. He's the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy here at the law school, and he's now working on group decision-making and various projects on the idea of liberty. He's here today to talk about his book, #Republic, Divided Democracy in the Age of Social Media. And as just a quick aside, I was talking to David Fierro, who's the National Archivist at the NARA, on Friday, and he said this is next on his list to read. So without further ado.
Okay, so I can say that in working on this book, I spent a lot of time with material that suggests the thesis of the book is no good. And I wasn't convinced by that, so I published the book. But the book did benefit from rejections of its own thesis, as I hope you'll see. So what I'm going to focus on in these remarks is some old and some new social science, which helps specify the mechanisms by which information cocooning occurs and by which it has an impact. So there's a guy at MIT named Nicholas Negroponte who spoke in the 1990s about something he called the daily me. There actually is a daily me, and you're seeing the reflection of the icon. The idea as it was understood by those who explored his idea was a kind of beautiful situation in which we wouldn't be deluged with material that didn't interest us. We wouldn't need to read stuff about, let's say, what's happening in Pakistan or in London. If we weren't interested, we could design a communications universe which would particularly fit our interests. Facebook, in its statement of its core values in 2016, basically embraced the notion of the daily me as its conception of the animating kind of spirit of its newsfeed. So in its statement, which was very earnest and well-designed and in a way unself-conscious, it said, you know, you should be able to see exactly what's meaningful to you, and there's a lot of stuff out there, and we're going to help you get what's meaningful to you. Okay, this is from a movie called Her, a brilliant movie. In my view, it cannot implausibly be ranked with Orwell's 1984 and Huxley's Brave New World. The movie Her involves an operating system with a good name, Samantha. And what the operating system does is it understands completely what our hero wants and needs, and it's fully personalized with respect to him. And of course, he falls in love with the operating system. You can see as a sharp contrast with the dystopian idea of an operating system which is personalized to you, it's your daily me kind of gone romantic. You can see the alternative being the depiction of the great cities by Jane Jacobs, a theorist of architecture, who spoke about intricate minglings of different uses in cities, urging that they're not a form of chaos. They represent a complex and highly developed form of order. What Jacobs was doing with this notion of order is celebrating an architecture of serendipity, which he opposes not with the terms, but I think with the theory, to an architecture of control. So you can see a daily me, or a operating system which completely knows you, as either via algorithm or through your own judgment, enabling perfect control of your communications environment to your specifications, either because of what you are interested in, what you value, or because of what your particular choices have been. That's not what Jacobs is embracing. What she's embracing is something altogether different, which is a social environment in which you're encountering stuff which you would never have put in your daily me, but which can expand your horizons alter your preferences, alter your values, and sometimes change your life. And that kind of vibrant, apparently chaotic, unpredictable, serendipity-ridden city is what Jacobs is inspired by. Okay, now a little old social science and then some new social science. This is a series of studies by a social psychologist named Solomon Asch, where you're asked to match lines with other lines in terms of their length. And as you can see from this slide, it's not really hard. So if you were in this study, you'd think, is this a study of recalcitrance or rebellion, or is this a study of visual ability, which it actually was styled to the experimental subjects as about, a study of perception. But at one point in the design, there's a disturbance where everyone in the room except for you makes a mistake. And the question is, what do you do? Now, this person, who's probably now the president of some country, and looks really handsome in real life now and distinguished, though there looks nerdy and baffled and a little irritated. This person, a real person in the experiment, is staring and saying, what? Why is everyone making a mismatch? Now, the fact is, a majority of participants, at least once on a series of rounds, is going to defy the evidence of his own senses to go along with the group. The group, by the way, as I hope is clear, they are confederates of the experimenter. They're not doing anything other than following his direction, because it's not a study of visual perception, it's a study of conformity. And the startling result is that ordinary people in multiple countries are going to defy, in their public statements of what's true, the evidence of their own senses in order to conform to the group. Okay, so there are puzzles here. Why are people going to deviate from what their eyes tell them? One reason is some participants apparently thought, I saw this line matching that line, but if everyone else saw it the other way, I must be wrong. So my own eyes must have deceived me, and with respect to the relevant fact, the informational content of the unanimous views of others overwhelms my own judgment. Now, I hope you're thinking about questions of fact or questions of law or questions of value, where there's something might be similar that we've all experienced, and it's certainly a cultural phenomenon. But there's a second driving mechanism here, which also helps explain some of the data, which is a number of the puzzled participants thought, I know what line matches another line, but I don't want to look like an idiot in front of a group of members of the human race. So I'm going to go along with them, not because I think they're right, but because that's the socially preferable thing to do. So think of this as eliciting in simple ways both the immense power of unanimity for information and the immense power of unanimity with respect to reputation. Okay, there's another old experiment, this is the only other old one I'm going to give you, which involves people's willingness to administer torture to other people. Stanley Milgram, a social psychologist, was trying really to understand Nazism and how it arose. And what he did by design was to put people in a room and ask them to administer electric shocks to someone else. And the question is, at what stage would they stop imposing the electric shocks when the participant in the experiment, who was the subject, that is the victim of the shocks, was crying out with increasing agitation and some combination of terror and torment as the shocks became more awful. Milgram's startling finding, even more startling than Asch's in the conformity experiment, is that most people are going to go way up in the torture scale. They will not resist the instruction, which is not coercive. There's no forced participation. They will not resist the instruction of the experimenter. You have to keep turning up the volume. The person's answering the questions wrong, and when the questions are answered wrong, turn it up. So the upshot of this story is that human beings either will defer to authority in contexts in which authority is asking, though not demanding, quite horrifying things. Okay, the question is, what's going on here? Milgram thought he was studying obedience. I have a different potential explanation, which he was really studying the same thing as what's principally driving the conformity results, which is information. If you have an experimenter in an experiment to which you have voluntarily participated, and the experimenter asks you to keep turning up the torture, there's a lot of informational content there. The experimenter is a professor at Yale in many of the studies, and probably subjects thought, well, if the experimenter thinks I should do this, I probably should. Not obedience so much as deference to the informational content given by the context. That's not Milgram's own explanation. Notice, if we indulge that explanation, the experimental subjects who engaged in torture, in quotation marks, and deferred to authority, they were actually right. There was no torture. It was all a setup. They were deferring to the authority of someone who seemed to be a reasonable person trying to produce learning. And while they heard screams, they were actually right. The screams were not, they didn't think the screams weren't real, but they thought this was a legitimate thing for them to be doing, and that was not wrong. Okay, now we're going to go to newer studies which are, I suggest, more directly suggestive about the downside of the power of personalization. Okay, a number of years ago, not super old like the other two, but a number of years ago at MIT across the way, there was a graduate student named Stoner. It's not the most fortunate name, but maybe it didn't have quite the meaning then it has now. Tried to explore how individuals and groups differed in their risk-taking taste. And what he discovered was systematically groups are more risk-inclined than individuals. So if the question is whether to make an investment or to launch a business or to take an employment prospect, a group of individuals would show a risky shift in the sense that the group would be more excited about risk-taking than the median individual. Got the basic finding? And so it was urged in a way that bears, I think, on much behavior on the internet, that risk-seeking behavior would be found more with collectives than with individuals. There was a confound, though, shortly thereafter, which is among Taiwanese subjects, there was a cautious shift, not a risky shift, which threw the very idea of a risky shift into confusion. Why are the Taiwanese citizens different from the Americans? Is there something cultural about America which makes our groups more risk-inclined than our individuals? Is Taiwan culturally different such that that's the opposite effect? Okay, as the numbers were analyzed, it turned out that the tempting cultural explanation was, along an interesting dimension, extremely false. The best predictor of the effect of group interactions is the group's pre-deliberation tendency. If the pre-deliberation tendency is toward risk, then the group will end up moving toward more risky decision-making. If the group's inclination is toward caution, then the group will end up more towards caution than the individual. Now that suggests a general phenomenon, group polarization, which has political importance and which bears on the effects of information cocoons. And I'm going to tell you right now about some informational cocoons, both experimental and real world. A number of years ago, I was involved in a study in Colorado where we got people in Boulder together in groups of 5 or 6 and asked them to record their anonymous views about climate change, same-sex couples, and affirmative action. And then we asked them to clump together in those groups and to deliberate to a group verdict. And then we asked them to record their views anonymously after the group verdict. Now, I was most interested in what would happen to their anonymous private views as a result of group deliberation. What do you think would happen? The result was actually quite simple, that in Boulder, left of center place, kind of like Cambridge or San Francisco, the pre-deliberation tendency was to be in favor of an agreement to control greenhouse gas emissions, to be in favor of allowing civil unions for same-sex couples, and to be in favor of affirmative action. That was the tendency. But there was diversity in the groups. As a result of deliberation in their anonymous post-deliberation statements, not the verdict, the anonymous post-deliberation statements, their internal diversity was crushed. They became uniform, confident, and extreme. They started all to love climate change agreements, affirmative action, and same-sex unions. Is this a phenomenon about the effects of internal interactions among people who are left of center? No. What we saw in Colorado Springs, right of center, was exactly the same. Their internal deliberations led them to despise affirmative action, essentially unanimously, to think a climate change agreement is a terrible idea, and to think that same-sex unions should not be recognized. So what happened as a result of this very artificial little experiment is that the Colorado Springs people and the Boulder people ended up occupying different political universes, which they didn't before they started to talk internally. Okay, got the mechanism? It's a lot like the risk-taking experiment, but now it's gone politicized. Okay, is that happening on the internet today? Absolutely. It's constructing, that is, social media are constructing the functional equivalent of our Colorado experiment. Okay, why did this happen? Here are 3 reasons. One involves the fact that on many political issues, people tend a little bit to the middle just by virtue of humility. So if you're not clear on climate change, you might think, well, I think we should probably sign an international agreement, but on a scale of 0 to 8, where 0 means definitely not, and 8 means sure, for sure we should, I'm at 5 or 6. But once you hear other people agree with you, you are corroborated. Corroboration breeds confidence, and confidence breeds more extremism, measured here as degree of clarity that your original conviction is correct. So the mechanism is very simple, that humility is diminished as others agree, and that leads to greater extremism on bounded scales, at least, that measure confidence. Second mechanism, I think, is the most important one, and it's a lot like the old conformity experiments. I've seen the Colorado tapes, by the way, and here's what you observe in real time happening. People start talking about climate change, let's say in Colorado Springs, and the number of arguments that suggest an international agreement is a bad idea crushes the number of arguments that suggest it's a good idea. Not because of anything other than the statistical distribution of views within Colorado Springs. So in a group whose antecedent tendency is not to think we should sign a Paris Accord, the number of arguments that point against signing the Paris Accord will be pretty high, and the number of arguments in favor will be relatively low. And if people are listening to one another, just as a statistical likelihood, they're going to move in direction of thinking the agreement's a bad idea. And you can see people's eyes lighting up as they're listening to one another, seeing, oh, the number of arguments and their plausibility that support one point of view is higher, and therefore I'm going to move there. And this happens mirror image quality in Boulder and Colorado Springs. Okay, the third explanation involves reputational concerns. You can also see in real time, in Colorado Springs, some of the people think affirmative action is a pretty good idea. But they're in a group that doesn't like affirmative action. And so their own willingness to be supportive of affirmative action is reduced. That does not clearly explain why their anonymous post-deliberation statements are negative about affirmative action, but it's kind of uncomfortable to have signed on to a group verdict, affirmative action is a terrible idea, and then to go around anonymously and say, actually, I like it. So the anonymous view probably is affected by the reputational pressure which produces the unanimous verdict. Okay, I'll tell you a little story about my own confirmation by the Senate. There was one senator, and we're going to name names. It's Senator Roberts from Kansas, whom I like very much. He had a hold on my confirmation, which meant he didn't allow, not only was he against me, he wouldn't allow a vote. That's pretty harsh. And we went in to meet him, as is standardly done. And what Senator Roberts said, you know what we need? We need someone, the job I was nominated for, we need someone at that job who's a professor. Probably should have a law degree. Probably should be at University of Chicago or Harvard. Probably should be interested in cost-benefit analysis. Probably should, he was basically reading my biography. And then I said, I have a brother exactly like that. And then he said, you're going to be great. I'm completely for you. And then he said, of course I'm going to vote against you. And that was about the reputational pressure that he faced. In the midst of one of the government shutdowns in Congress, there was a very similar sidebar discussion where Republicans were saying at the time, this shutdown is a terrible idea, but we have to stand united in favor of it as long as we can. The reason is our constituents are demanding it, and if we don't, we are going to face electoral retribution in the form of a primary challenge. Now, both of those tales were, I think, tales about Colorado Springs and Boulder and the effects of interaction, at least among the relevant constituents. Okay, here's a slightly more complicated study, but I think its implications are large. The study is to figure out why juries are awarding variable punitive damage awards. And so I was involved in a study in which we asked lots of people, and you can think of this as having analogs in terms of internet questions, about the appropriate punishment of a company that did something wrong, where the wrong thing might be evaluated as really wrong, like an exercise machine designed for old people, which makes them fall and break their arms. People don't like that. They think that on a scale of 0 to 8 is a 7 or a 6, and they want to punish it hard. Or a case which I would have given on a scale of 0 to 8, 12. People tend to give 1 or 2. That is a failed baldness cure. They think that's not that big a deal, 1 or 2. Not a big punishment. Okay, so we asked people to scale on the numbers and then to come up with dollar awards. And our basic finding was people agree whether something's a 2 or a 5, and they don't agree on dollars, and the problem seems to be the dollar scale is extremely hard to make sense of. So whether a $10 million or a $100,000 award is the right one, you're just guessing. Okay, people responded to the study by saying there's something wrong with the study, which is that the juries that you are describing as such, they aren't deliberating juries, they're statistical juries, where you're just taking the median judgment, and that's wrong. We were very confident that we had it right, so we did a study of deliberating juries, just to have a footnote to our article to establish that it had the correct analysis. Turned out we were wrong. We were like wildly wrong. If people thought the case was a 5, that is the median juror thought the case was a 5 in terms of outrageousness, the jury's going to come in at 6. There is a systematic shift toward greater severity on the part of juries than jurors. If they thought it was a 2, the baldness case, then they'd come in at 1, a systematic leniency shift. With dollars, it always went up. Okay, the simplest explanation, the most parsimonious explanation, is that with respect to outrage, if you're mad and you're surrounded by people who are mad, you're going to end up more mad. The collectivity will be more outraged than the individual. And that's just a replication of the risky shift phenomenon in the context of, here, a legally relevant moral judgment, that is outrage. Okay, let me talk now about judges, and this isn't experimental at all, in the sense that there's nothing artificial about this. This is real. The United States has conducted a natural experiment of a very extraordinary sort for a long time now. That is, the panels are 3-judge panels, and they can consist, and this is going to exhaust the possibilities, of 3 Republican appointees, 3 Democratic appointees, 2 Democratic appointees and 1 Republican, or 2 Republican appointees and 1 Democrat. That's it. Because of that design, you can find out, if people are obsessive enough to do some counting, how Republican and Democratic appointees' voting behavior shifts depending on the people with whom they're sitting. Now let's take as a hypothesis, this isn't going to startle anyone, that a Republican judge is more likely in ideologically contested cases to vote in a stereotypically conservative way than a Democratic judge. That's true. But if you want to know how a judge is going to vote in a ideologically inflected case, it is often more predictive to know what is the political party of the president who appointed the 2 other judges on the panel than to know what is the political party of the judge in whose voting behavior you're interested. That's weird. If you want to know how a Bush appointee is going to vote, don't ask, is this a Bush appointee? Ask, is this Bush appointee sitting with Obama appointees or Bush appointees? Now, for present purposes, the most dramatic finding is that on an RRR panel, the likelihood of a conservative vote by an R is wildly higher than the likelihood of a conservative vote from an R on an RDD panel. That is to say, a Republican sitting with 2 Republican judges looks like Colorado Springs, and a Democrat sitting with 2 Democratic judges looks like Boulder. Now, this shouldn't happen in judicial decision-making. It looks like that there's such amplification effects that the likelihood that a D with 2 Ds votes in a liberal fashion is typically about twice as high as the likelihood that an R votes in a liberal fashion when R is sitting with RRR on an RRR panel. Now, what that suggests on the ground is that in many areas of the law, the likelihood of a liberal vote by a D on a DDD panel is 70%, and by an R on an RRR panel is 30 to 40%. It's not as stark as Boulder versus Colorado Springs, but this ought not to happen. Okay. I'll pass a little numbers and just say that the only clear exceptions are abortion and capital punishment, where judges vote in the stereotypically liberal or conservative fashion, and it's irrelevant with whom they're sitting. And just notice, as one further kind of nail in the coffin, so to speak, of independent-minded judgment, that it turns out that across a wide spectrum of American political opinion, people are much more likely to support a particular political outcome if they are told that the majority supports it than if they're told the majority rejects it. So we get quite significant effects on people's judgments about certain political issues depending on what they think. Okay, I think at this point I'm going to just jump to the relevant architectures. So Jacobs urges it's possible to be on excellent sidewalk terms with people who are very different from oneself, and is, even as time passes, on familiar public terms with them. Such relations can and do endure for many years, for decades. And this is kind of plain prose, but there's real emotion in it in context about the extent to which in a great city, Cambridge or New York or Berlin or San Francisco or Colorado Springs, you see people who are very different from you and adopt enduring relationships. So she urges the tolerance, the room for great differences among neighbors, differences that often go far deeper than differences in culture, which are possible and normal only when streets of great cities have built-in equipment, allowing strangers to dwell in peace together. And here's the money sentence, I think. Lowly, unpurposeful, and random as they may appear, sidewalk contexts are the small change from which a city's wealth of public life may grow. Facebook, by contrast, urges the goal of the news feed is to show people the stories that are most relevant to them. In fact, the news feed is animated by core values. If you could look through thousands of stories and choose the 10 that were most important to you, which would they be? The answer should be your newsfeed, subjective, personal, and unique, and that defines the spirit of what we hope to achieve. If you're with me, the right question to ask is really that Facebook is adopting kind of a radical rejection of what Jacobs is celebrating in a city, those serendipitous contexts, and celebrating the subjective, personal, and unique. There's a problem there. Here are just a few numbers on Twitter with respect to political issues like marriage equality and presidential campaigns. People are sharing stuff with people who agree with them. Non-political issues like the Super Bowl and the marathon bombing, no, we're not seeing the echo chamber effect. But politicizable issues like a school shooting, it can begin in a relatively nonpartisan manner, but it gradually becomes more polarized as discussions about gun control policies come to the fore. This is very alarming. If you have something, a hashtag that says Black Lives Matter, and that is a signal for people of a particular orientation to click on that stuff, then you are creating Boulder. Our experiments Boulder, not real world Boulder. If you have hashtag All Lives Matter, then, and if that is predictably, as it turns out to be, by people who have a particular view, which is Black Lives Matter is a bad idea, then you're creating, by virtue of the hashtag, our Colorado Springs experiment. And we're talking not just of, a little social science thing, but of thousands and potentially millions of people who are being sorted into an information cocoon. So on Twitter, with respect to political campaigns, you can find that political retweets exhibit a highly segregated partisan structure with really limited connectivity between left and right-leaning users. Okay, that's not innocuous if the effect of it is to create a situation in which people are seeing people who disagree with them not as fellow discussants, but as adversaries or enemies. The Facebook data is a little more complicated, but the suggestion is the old algorithm both contributes, what the new one is unclear, but the old one both contributes to information cocooning, and that self-sorting through self-clicking aggravates that effect. Okay, so the conclusion is group polarization, which I've emphasized here, and biased assimilation by which people find convincing information that fits their predilections and dismiss information that doesn't, are both very important. There's a lot to be said, if you're with me, for the RRD and the DDR panels. I trust them more than the RRR and DDD panels. And notice that on the RRD panels, R's show much more moderate voting patterns, even though they have a majority. They don't need to listen to the D, but their voting patterns suggest they do. And Ds are completely similar. Social media are making things worse. So we'll end with an old passage from John Stuart Mill, speaking at the time actually of international trade. Mill urged, "It's hardly possible to overstate the value in the present state of human improvement of placing human beings in contact with persons dissimilar to themselves and with modes of thought and action unlike those with which they are familiar. Such communication," Mill quietly urged, "has always been, and is peculiarly in the present age, one of the primary sources of progress." Thanks. Comments, questions? This is a social science experiment, and you just gave some amazing data. Okay, there's an economic incentive. The person who asked the first question gets a reward. Maybe that's a disincentive.
Thank you. It's very interesting. I'm curious, you yourself, potentially as a role model, living in Cambridge, which is potentially one of the most liberal bubbles in the entire world, how you yourself get outside of that and hear alternative viewpoints.
Okay, so I appreciate that, but I'll tell you, I think my own news consumption habits are, to me at least, one of the most uninteresting questions imaginable, but it may be that it has general interest to question how someone who worked for President Obama or identified as not right of center. So the fact is that I think, just speaking for myself, that if you think of yourself as part of a political tribe, that's extremely damaging. And it's better to think of individual questions. So, my own media consumption habits, you're going to fall asleep. I read the American Economic Review. I go on the National Bureau of Economic Research website basically every day to see what papers are up there or what might I have missed. I look at the Quarterly Journal of Economics. I'm looking at a bunch of law reviews all the time. I read psychological science. Most of those have no ideological valence, and there'll be something that suggests that some policy that Democrats like is great, and there'll be something suggesting it's horrible on basically every day. In terms of media consumption, I try to read a range of things. So the Wall Street Journal has not been thinking that the Democratic Party is right on most things, and I learned a lot from the Wall Street Journal. I find the good journalistic outlets, the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, I regard as two. Much of their reporting, you can't tell the ideological valence. They're just telling stuff that happened, and that's really helpful. So one of the great things about social media and the internet is that geography is less important. So if you live in Cambridge or Colorado Springs, you're leftish and rightish, there's no need that what you learn is massively affected by the fact that people who live there tend to be of a certain ideological stripe. Maybe I could say one more point, which is that, just speaking for myself, I'm much more interested in evidence and facts than in opinions. So as I free associated, National Bureau of Economic Research, Quarterly Journal of Economics, Psychological Science, I have no idea what the political views of their authors are. They probably affect their choice of topic, and maybe they affect their results, but it's evidence.
Sorry. Is it possible that interacting with people in agreement makes one happier, and Facebook's intention is just that, making the customers happier to make money?
Okay, that's a great point. So probably it is roughly correct that the Facebook news feed was not saying, we want echo chambers. We want people to enjoy their experience of Facebook. And we're trying to find things that are meaningful to people. And yes, though the word happy has many different meanings, and the idea of being in a cozy place where what you see on your news feed just supports your own views, that can get a little dull or a little confining after a while. And seeing things that are new topics or new points of view can be energizing. And isn't it pleasing once in a while? I mean, maybe pleasing more than once in a while to think, oh, I was wrong on that one. I mean, there's something, the lights turn on. It's a little dark if it's, yes. So I think you're right about something about what Facebook was thinking when that was written. It's like a company that's trying to provide you options that look like you're going to enjoy them. with respect to, say, food or clothing, rather than stuff you'll hate. That's profit, good for profit, and it's also good for interactions. But it seems from the public record as if Facebook and other forms of social media are rethinking the conception of happiness. And there are a number of technology innovators now who are helping people to see stuff which is very different from what they would have been algorithmed into.
Hi. So I was wondering, what do you see as the relation between this sort of work and I guess just in the past few months we've seen on college campuses, and I think there were a few incidents at the law school in the past couple of years, for example, of no platforming, so-called no platforming techniques becoming violent and things like that. Do you see there as being a link between, maybe you don't want to comment, but do you see there as being a link between campus controversies and this kind of information cascade and epistemic silos and things like that?
Well, the reason you're probably detecting discomfort on my part, it's not because I don't want to comment, it's because I just don't know a lot about what's happening on campuses. And I do think that people who think about self-government and democracy on campuses give far too much attention to campuses and far too little attention to how people who have the amazing privilege of being on a campus can use what they're learning for something that has larger effects. Now, I don't want to diminish the importance of what happens on campuses. From a very narrow band of knowledge, there are in some parts of American universities Colorado Springs and Boulder equivalents, where you have people who are in some sort of information cocoon with respect to something, and that can lead them not to want to hear or to demonize people who think something else, and that's that's unwelcome. So.
I was a little bit puzzled by the distinction you made in the torture experiment about obedience and information. And I was wondering if information is not an inherent part of obedience, because it's usually related with authority and therefore with legitimacy, which conveys information. And in a second related question, I was wondering if in the group experiment deliberation, were there any factors that tilted the tendency? Meaning if someone had some kind of authority, for example, was a professor, or was a brilliant oralist, or had a lot of data, did that change the tendency of the group deliberation?
Those are both great questions. So in the data I've been involved in, the judges' data where we have no insight into the internal discussions, and the jury data and the Colorado data, there's no evidence that particular people have had particular authority. Partly, we just don't have enough statistical power to try to measure that. But there is data, fascinating data, that suggests there's one class of problems where you won't see group polarization. And they're frequently described as eureka problems, where the answer once announced is clear to everyone, and people just go there. So if we were all doing a crossword puzzle, this entire group, we'd probably do really well, because some people would say, oh, I know, who invented the light bulb, and begins with E, and it has that number of letters, Edison. Is it Edison? Thomas Edison? Okay, so that's the only crossword puzzle answer I know, by the way. But, and groups are not going to polarize because the answer once announced. And that does suggest your intuition's right, that if someone is thought to have expertise within the group and is trusted, then the person says, oh, this is the case, and then the group will, under reasonable assumptions, yield. Okay, so there's that. The first question again was?
About the relation on obedience.
Oh, yes, that's also a great question. Okay, so I think what Milgram, or many of Milgram's followers, understand by obedience is that if someone has authority over you, even if they don't have a coercive authority, you follow them out of deference to their authority. And all of us have sometimes done that, thinking, haven't we? Thinking, we've all had bosses, and sometimes the boss actually has relevant coercive authority, but sometimes not, and we still do it. And sometimes we do it not because we think they're right, we're quite clear they aren't, and not because they can fire us, but they're the boss, we just obey. And Milgram's analysis, which undoubtedly has considerable truth to it, is that when horrible things are done, Nazism was for him a defining case, and you can think of your least favorite country in which horrible things are done. The people who are doing those things often aren't different from you and me. They are obeying a superior, even if the superior doesn't hold sanctions over them. That's the theory. But there's another theory which is complementary. It doesn't displace this, which is that often the reason you obey is not that there's authority. It's that you think that person kind of knows. And it's like the conformity experiments. And what I'm speculating, the data is, let's just say, not fully informative on which account is right. But what I'm speculating is a reasonable reading of the Milgram experiment is the subjects who were students at universities were thinking, this person probably knows what's best to do. And it turns out they were right. But even if it turned out they were wrong, they might have been deferring to perceived informational advantage on the part of the experimenter rather than just obeying. And which one is the driver in different contexts? You need to know about the context. But what I'm suggesting is that I think we greatly underrate the extent to which the informational signals given by fellow members of the human race drive us in multiple directions, given the fact that with respect to so many things we just don't know. As individuals, the Earth goes around the sun. Albert Einstein existed. George Washington was the first president. Those are three things that most Americans accept, but we have no direct reason to believe any of them. Maybe the Earth goes around the sun, maybe we have that, but at least most of us, we take it from the views of others. So the extent to which those parts of our deepest convictions are based on anything we actually know, rather than the shared judgment of others, it's a tiny, tiny fragment, even of things on which our lives depend. And that maybe puts in clearer light the extent to which information cocoons on the part of quite rational people can lead to crazy beliefs. So here's another way to put it that, this is vivid. So economists say, this is going to be a vulgarization, but it's good to be Bayesian, to be a rational updater. You do Bayesian updating. And people do that, but they're sometimes credulous Bayesians. So if you go to someone on the street and ask them what time is it, you will expect they will tell you the truth rather than be cruel or mischievous and just mislead you. But there are contexts in which the people who are like the people telling you what time it is, they have an agenda, they have their own bias, they actually have no idea, or they are trying to push you in a particular direction. And all four of those things are typically discounted because in ordinary life we don't encounter that, at least with our friends. And so this is a way of saying that the reading I'm giving of Milgram's maybe is more connected to the daily me, the problem of the daily me. And I'm sure the educational settings are among them, but the fact that we know people in political domains in every country on the face of the earth who believe a lot of stuff that is false or actually destructive. Yeah.
So my question is, with this, assuming that your thesis is true, how do we fix this? Other than getting Mark Zuckerberg to read the book before his commencement address. It seems to me that Facebook's algorithm is been optimized to drive user engagement, and it's ended up where it is because that's what engages users, and there's a chance that that's just a local maximum and not a global maximum, and maybe if you started from a different point, you would get a more diversified result. But it seems like it's in Facebook's business interest to have this cocooning. So how do you see, what are the situations you see that could play out where Facebook, Twitter, some of these other platforms actually do promote a greater diversity of views?
Okay, so it seems from the public record that Facebook is rethinking its newsfeed with an eye in part toward this issue. And whether that's being done in response to data they have internally or in response to a perceived public demand, not exactly clear. But I think it would be surprising if in 2016, let's say Facebook had hit the perfect business model given its economic and social goals. It could be, but Facebook's own self-understanding, and to its credit, it's in the 2016 statement, is that we're going to keep iterating. And probably Facebook, from the public record, is concerned, A, with its duty to its shareholders, and B, with its social role. That the people who work there are not hoping to contribute to a problem of information cocooning. They're hoping to provide something that's good, all things considered. They have consciences. And so I think Facebook could and probably will do significantly better. We're also seeing an emergence, just in the recent past, of all sorts of apps and technologies which are targeted at exactly this issue. And there are like 8 of them that have appeared publicly maybe in the last 2 months. And some of them are starting to take off. Early days, and there are people all around, maybe people in this room, who are working either on the theory or on the tech side to see what can be done. So I think the first step really is to have an ideal in mind, and the ideal of the Daily Me or of Facebook 2016 is so unhelpfully unself-conscious about the individual and social consequences that to have something like Jane Jacobs' idea as a counterpoint, then the technology, then they'll build it. If they build it, we will come.
Hi. Well, on the phenomenon of cocooning, I was curious about your thoughts on one thing. We mentioned university campuses briefly. Even within campuses, there's a degree of cocooning, in the sense that, I mean, at a place like Harvard, there are people from all over the world. But if you ask me for my views on country X, I might have some views, but can I say what people from that country think? I wouldn't have engaged with people from that country, even if they're around on campus, and I still have opinions. So while we talk about getting out of our bubble, it seems like cocooning takes place at even close to us. We have cocoons. So do you have any thoughts on that? If we can't even somehow manage to interact with people near us, how do we go outside of our geographical space or cyberspace?
Okay, so I'll tell you, your question inspires me to kind of get close to the beating heart of the book. 40,000 Americans died on highways in 2016. That's up from 2015, and that's up from 2014. The United States has a problem of persistent poverty. It's racially inflected. It's not as bad as it could otherwise be, but it's, for a country with our wealth, this is not ideal, and it's a soluble problem. Or at least it's a dentable problem, let's say. We have, obviously, two problems that the behavioral research suggests are extremely difficult for people to bear. One is mental illness, and the other is chronic pain. And infrastructure in the United States is not where a country of our wealth should be. Now, I've identified a series of problems that have extremely real, concrete human consequences. And while the 40,000 highway deaths may not be the champion of those, let's just bear that in mind. 40,000 dead people in a country which has immense learning about how to prevent those deaths and hasn't brought that to bear. Okay, so then the idea of university campuses where maybe people aren't learning from people about other countries, that is an issue. But the self-segregation into, regulation is terrible, or the companies have rigged everything, how's that going to help with any of the problems identified? So what would help with the problems identified? Either if we had some technical space in which people could do stuff about that, which we do to some extent, or if we had some engagement on some substantive issue that really matters on the part of people who care about them. And to some extent we have those. But the picture of the news feed where they're self-sorting is not helpful on those things, and it's actually destructive. And so now I'm getting at where the emotion of the book comes from. It's about a series of substantive things on which human well-being actually depends. Like, really? In the sense that people are either going to suffer or not, or live or not, and what are we going to do about that? And if we have something like Mill's conception, then that's one route to progress, because knowledge is dispersed and learn from one another. Or we can create spaces of insulation from the noise, where people at the Department of Transportation or people at the Department of Health and Human Services can actually address the problem of highway fatalities and mental illness.
Time now, but thanks again for coming to our book talk, and I just want to let you know, thanks again, Professor Sunstein, and you have to keep right outside the door with books, and Professor Sunstein here to sign before you.
Thank you all.